Welcome to the walkthrough for Assignment 4's Frequently Made Mistakes. First and foremost, please make sure you document your code consistently and format it consistently as well. This has been an issue for some people throughout the course, so please make sure you use the same formatting and commenting that we've been talking about in all the examples so far. Next, let's take a look at some problems with crawl page async. Quite a number of people weren't implementing the filtering properly, so you need to make sure you filter out the page URI if the page depth, the depth of the recursion has been exceeded, or if you've already visited the page. And make sure you do things in that order. This particular implementation doesn't work properly because, as you can see, it's only checking the depth, but it's not checking to see if the page has been visited already. And you can figure out how to do this by taking a look at the other solutions that you've already implemented. The same basic logic applies. This implementation here makes no sense. For some reason, it's making a recursive call to perform crawl, which just makes no sense at all. So please go back and look more carefully at the previous assignments and how you handled the filtering there. Down here, we have a somewhat different problem. This doesn't check to see if the depth has been exceeded, and it's also not checking correctly to see if the page has been visited already. So don't do that either. That's also a mistake. Now, here's a subtle problem that has a good solution that doesn't quite work yet because the unit tests are somewhat wonky for some reason. So you should use a method reference here. We're in the process of fixing the unit tests, so we'll get that out just as soon as we can. But that really should be a method reference, not a lambda expression. So right now the test will blow up for some strange reason if you don't put a lambda expression there, but we'll fix that shortly. So make sure you do that before the final submission in a couple weeks. Now let's take a turn to some other methods. This is the images on page async links method. So the key thing to note here is that there needs to be a call to subscribe on, but that call to subscribe on needs to be nested inside the call to flat map rather than appearing after flat map. And the reason for that is otherwise you don't have the flat map concurrency idiom that we discussed in class. It won't actually run concurrently in the way that we're trying to get it to run. So you'll need to put the subscribe on after the call to crawl page async inside the call to flat map. Not really that hard, just about rearranging where things go. We're also going to see if we can improve the unit test to flag that as a problem. And make sure you do put a call to subscribe on here. Some people just omitted it altogether. And if you omit it altogether, then we don't get the proper concurrency at all, which is not desirable. Let's now move down to images on page async. There's a bunch of issues here, some of which are kind of our fault because the original specification was not very precise. And the main thing you'll need to do, and I think everybody needs to do this, is the code needs to be refactored to use the flat map concurrency idiom, since otherwise there won't be proper concurrency. And we'll update the unit test to test for this, and I'll also be happy to talk more about how to do this, but the original way we'd arranged the comments didn't quite give you the right tips. So you should kind of ignore that and look back to the discussions about the flat map concurrency idiom, and we'll talk more about that. I'll be happy to have some other videos or maybe some material that we'll put out as amended skeletons for your inspection to see more how to arrange things to use the proper flat map concurrency idiom. Basically, what you're going to do is you're going to have flat map, and then you're going to essentially have the subscribe on inside of flat map. And we'll talk about that in some other context. Also, make sure that this is really strange, make sure you don't use get or download image directly, and also we'll see the same thing is true for apply transform later in the transform image async method. And for various reasons that I don't fully understand, for some reason, RxJava doesn't like to have map return nulls. And if you take a look at the code you write when you have a method that can return a null, it gives very strange warnings. And so the way to avoid this is to use the optional wrapper. So what you want to do here is you want to make sure that the call to get or download image is wrapped inside of a call to optional.ofNullable. And what that does is it says, if get or download image returns null, we still have an optional, just has no value. It's is present will be false. But if it returns a non-null value, then of course we'll have a valid optional or an optional where the value is present. So first thing you need to do is you need to wrap the call within an optional. And then down here, you shouldn't be filtering on objects not null or non-null. And when you take a look at your code, you'll see that the IDE is complaining about this. And I think, again, it has to do with sort of expectations that RxJava has about nulls. So bottom line is you'll have to use optionals here. We'll talk more about the optionals you should use when we get down to the transform image async method, because it's basically the same sort of thing. And then down here, the very last part of this has a flat map call, which calls transform image async. And you don't actually need to put subscribe on after that, because there's a subscribe on in transform image async. So it's already running asynchronously. And also in this particular case, if you do all the other pieces correctly, you don't need to say opt.get. You'll already have it be in an actual value form. We'll talk about that in a second. Okay, so let's talk about some problems with transform image async. So whenever you're doing the filtering of optionals, use optional is present. Use that method reference, don't use optional of. Down here, same sort of thing. This does correctly use optional.ofNullable when calling the apply transform method. That's correct. But then you don't want to be mixing filter with objects : non-null, because that just will never happen. So you shouldn't mix optionals and filtering for null, because that's the whole point of optionals, is to not have to deal with nulls. Let's take a look down here. Some more problems with transform image async. A lot of these things are variations on the same sorts of confusions, and I understand why it's confusing, and optionals are a little weird, but they're good to know how to use. So first of all, don't make naked calls to apply transform. Use optional.ofNullable. Don't use filter objects non-null. You should use optional here instead. In this particular case, don't do this. Don't first call apply transform and then use optional nullable with map. Instead, what you want to do is you want to make the optional.ofNullable here when we do apply transform. So what that'll do is that'll make this thing be an optional right from the start. So we're going to get an optional back. And then what you're going to do is you're going to use filter to filter out optionals that aren't present. So the way you do it is you use filter with the optional : is present method reference. And what that'll do is that'll get rid of any optionals that are empty, because is present means it's non-empty. And then you go ahead and use map with optional get. So that's kind of the pattern that you should apply. And here's some other things a lot of people did. It just doesn't quite work right, and you'll get weird warnings from IntelliJ and the RxJava APIs. So use optional of nullable. Don't be wrapping stuff like this. If you take a look, the code will give you a weird warning. It'll say something like, replace this with true, because it will always be true. And that's not really what you want. You don't want to have that behavior. So you don't need to have optional of nullable image.isPresent, optional of nullable image.get. That's too complicated. So instead, basically just have a chain where you do optional.ofNullable. So now you have a stream of optionals. Then go ahead and use the isPresent method reference with filter to get rid of things that are empty. And then come down and use map again with the optional get method reference, and that will get the value out of that stuff. And if, at some point, if I have more time, I'm going to sit down and see if there's a way to write the apply transform method to be cleaner and not have to stream these things together like this. But this is the best I've come up with so far. So that should make the compiler happy, that should get the right results, and that should make the unit tests happy. So those are the frequently made mistakes I saw. Probably the most important thing to understand conceptually is the whole issue of the flat map concurrency idiom. So please go ahead and go back and rewatch the video that talks about the flat map concurrency idiom. I think we talked about that in maybe the EX3 example. So there were a couple of videos from earlier in the week that talked about the flat map concurrency idiom, and really try to get your head around that. It's very idiosyncratic, which is why it's an idiom. And it's very specific to this variant of RxJava, this variant of reactive streams. There are other ways of doing these kinds of parallel processing with RxJava or with Project Reactor using other classes, things like, for example, parallel flowables and so on. We're not going to talk about those right now. If we have time, we will talk about those the last week of class. But for this assignment, we're just focusing on using the flat map concurrency idiom. So please make sure you kind of get your head around that. It's pretty cool. And there's some links that are part of the slides that will walk you through kind of comparing and contrasting the flat map concurrency idiom in RxJava with other ways of doing things in RxJava. But the main thing you want to do now is understand the flat map concurrency idiom. Okay, so that's basically what we're going to do. Everybody has something to work on. And so please make sure that you start on this. We will get the unit tests updated just as quickly as possible. Certainly by the time you get back from Thanksgiving break. So do what you can between now and then, but you don't have to spend your whole break working on this. I think most people are fairly close, so it shouldn't take too much time to make the tweaks in order to get all the tests passing once we update the tests.